Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bustamante, and this video is about 8.2, which is energy flow through ecosystems. Actually, in this video, we're kind of going to focus on the second half, how it's listed in the CED. We're going to talk about, explain how changes in energy availability affect populations of an ecosystem, and explain how the activities of autotrophs and heterotrophs enable the flow of energy in an ecosystem. And then we're going to kind of come back to the other part in a different video. So let's go ahead and get started here. I want to be clear about what we're talking about because there's kind of some things we can talk about when we talk about flow of things. We can talk about energy flow or chemical cycling, right? In this video, we're talking about energy flow. We're going to study the transfer of energy through living things. And if we think back to our law of thermodynamics, right, we need to remember as we go through this that every time we change forms of energy, we get a little bit less usable energy. Now, remember, energy can't be created or destroyed. So what's happening to that energy? A lot of that energy that's no longer usable, right, gets lost, even though it's not gone, to the form of heat. It's just transferred to heat instead. So we're looking at how energy, say, goes from producers or chemical energy initially in the sun to producers to herbivores to carnivores, and then actually even gets decomposed by decomposers and broken down. Now, we can talk about the energy transfer of that, but also when we do this, we're seeing chemical cycling too, right? We're seeing things transferred from one organism to another as they digest it and they eat it. This becomes especially important when we look at our decomposers because they're kind of our last stand in breaking them down. However, you'll notice in a lot of these, we don't talk about them in the images as far as energy transferred. And probably that's mostly because we think about them more as breaking down the chemical process, not necessarily transferring energy so much along the way, although they do. So some energy is used or lost. Remember, it's not really lost. It's just transferred to a different form. It makes it unusable. Every time we change a trophic level, or every time we change from one level to the next. So what's our general energy flow, right? Most of the time we have light energy. It gets captured by the process of photosynthesis, by typically plants, right? There are some bacteria and fungi that can also capture things through chemiosmosis, or not chemiosmosis, excuse me, but energy chemosynthesis, there we go, and transfer it that way. But typically we think light energy from the sun goes to the plants, and other things eat the plants. Some of it is lost as heat energy, but some of it gets transferred on to herbivores or other organisms that eat those plants. So the first thing I want to talk about is some vocabulary. This unit has a lot of vocabulary, but most students have studied this before, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. First thing I want to talk about are autotrophs. Autotrophs capture energy from physical or chemical sources in the environment. We like to call them autotrophs. Auto is like self, and troph is like food. So they make their own food. Well, we know about the process by which they make their own food, if you will, and that's typically photosynthesis, right? We talk about those as photosynthetic organisms. They capture that energy from sunlight, transform it through a chemical process into usable energy by themselves, and then they'll pass it on to things that eat them, or as they decompose, so to speak. Then we have chemosynthetic organisms. They capture energy from small inorganic molecules present in their environment, and this process can occur in the absence of oxygen. Now, this happens, but it's not as common to us because we don't see it as much, right? As much as we see plants. It's typically done by bacteria that obtain energy from the oxidation of inorganic compounds. And it's typically found in vents, in volcanic vents, when we look at, say, the ocean floor or something like that. So what are heterotrophs? Heterotrophs have to capture energy present in carbon compounds produced by other organisms. Basically, heterotrophs have to eat other things. Hetero is other, right? They have to eat other or different things in order to get their energy source. But they can metabolize carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, all these macromolecules we talked about as sources of energy and hydrolysis, right? Giving off water, if you will. There are different types of heterotrophs. There can be herbivores. Herbivores are, you can think of kind of like vegetarians. They would only eat plants. We can have carnivores that would only eat other animals. In other ways, they would only eat meat. Or we can have omnivores, and omnivores are going to eat both plants and animals. And typically when we look at what we see in food chains and food webs here in a second, organisms can sometimes fit into lots of different, what we're going to say, trophic levels, but it's typically based on what they eat and what they need to survive. So one way we can organize to visualize the flow of energy is through a food chain. A food chain is just a simple path of energy through an ecosystem. I'm going to highlight this again, a simple path of energy through an ecosystem. Okay, so each arrow shows the flow of energy. It shows the flow of energy. So here's what I want to talk about. Okay, say this is a grasshopper, and say this mouse mole thing eats this grasshopper. Okay, this arrow shows me that the energy that was in the grasshopper gets transferred to the mouse when it gets eaten. Then the snake will eat the mouse. And when the snake eats the mouse, this energy gets transferred to the snake. And then when the hawk eats the snake, this energy from the snake gets transferred to the hawk. So you'll notice the arrows, very importantly, show your transfer of energy, okay? How energy is moving from one place to another. Each organism of food chain has what we call a different trophic level, or a feeding role. So let's go through those trophic levels a little bit. Now there's lots of different names and terms you can use here. As we go through this, we're going to look at a terrestrial food chain and an aquatic food chain. And there's actually a little bit of differences, but we're going to kind of talk through some of those. So what's your first level in a food chain? Typically is your producers, okay? Terrestrial food chain, this is like our plants. Aquatic food chain, this might be something like phytoplankton, Okay, something is going to eat it, so we'll notice this energy transfer, and this would be our first level, say, in our food chain. Notice we're leaving out decomposers. Oftentimes they're left out in food chains and food webs here in a bit. Then we have our grasshoppers here in our terrestrial food chain, or our zooplankton. In our aquatic food chain, these are primary consumers. Why do we call them primary consumers? Well, because they eat our producers. They're like one level above, if you will. Sometimes you'll hear them called herbivores because typically they only eat plants, particularly in this grasshopper sense. Above that, we have secondary consumers. They're like our next up consumers. The mouse or the herring would be an example of that because they would eat, say, the primary consumers. Then we would have our tertiary consumers, the snake or the tuna. They would eat your secondary consumers. And finally, you would have, say, your quaternary consumers, like your hawk or your killer whale. Now, typically food chains and food webs don't go above these 4 levels because there's really just not enough energy available to support any more organisms. In a little bit, we're going to talk about every time we go from one trophic level to the next to a higher trophic level, we only transfer about 10% of the available energy. The rest gets lost in other ways like heat and metabolism. So that's why we see less and less organisms as we go through, say, a food chain or a food web. So what's a food web, right? It's really just a more complex way of showing all the connections of species in a given place. It's many food chains kind of put together. And it's a little bit more realistic, a little bit more accurate, right? Because typically most organisms eat more than just one food source. It can show multiple trophic levels. An organism can actually be in multiple trophic levels depending on which relationship you're looking at. Some organisms you can see are actually omnivores here, meaning they eat plants and other animals, which you can't really tell in a food chain because it's just showing us one option. But food webs, you'll notice, can show us those options. This kind of brings me to the point that having diverse ecosystems and stable ecosystems is really important, okay? Why? Okay, if we lose one organism or something happens to one specific population, it can really disrupt everything else in this ecosystem. So the more variety of food sources and plants, basically the bigger biodiversity we have in a given food web, the more stable that ecosystem is and the more likely it is to survive, right? Basically, we're saying if something happened to one thing in that ecosystem, it's better for the whole ecosystem if it's really diverse. because there's more ways to support it and regrow, if you will. So we can organize this idea of energy transfer in a couple different ways. The first one I want to talk about here is an energy pyramid, okay? And it shows the amount of energy available at the trophic levels. Approximately only about 10% of the energy is transferred from one level to the next. And some energy is actually lost as heat, and some is used up as the organism's metabolism itself. But when we look at this, what do I want you to notice? There are tons of producers, tons of plants, right, which all get their energy from the sunlight. And that's really important because they're at the bottom, if you will, of our pyramid. They're supporting everything else above it. So we have to have lots of them in order to support our higher up trophic levels. Then we have our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and you'll notice there's very few tertiary consumers, meaning there's a little amount of energy there in comparison, right? And this one doesn't even have a quaternary consumer, which sometimes doesn't happen just because there's not enough energy available to support organisms living in that environment. So you'll notice that you see pretty dramatic changes as you move through this energy pyramid, and you just move the decimal over one place, and that'll give you your 10% energy transfer from one to the next. We can also have a biomass pyramid. This shows us the mass of all the organisms at each trophic level. The dominant species, you could say the species at the bottom, the most of it is typically your plant or your producer, right? Because it supports everything above it. And we need to have lots of them because of that 10% rule. But so even when we look at that, right, we see at the top, we have the least amount of biomass. Biomass is just living mass, if you will, because we have less organisms in that category. Now, this is probably not actually drawn really to scale, right, because it moves very linearly, kind of. And we saw in our energy pyramid, which was a little bit better, that jump is pretty big. But it's just the idea that we have to have more biomass at the bottom than at the top of a trophic level to support everything at the top. Okay, we can also have a pyramid of numbers. This shows the number of organisms at each trophic level. Primary consumers are most of the entire community, right? Or after primary producers. So notice it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, number of individuals as you go up, the trophic levels, because you have less energy to support them, right? The amount of energy you really have from one trophic level to the next really supports how much you can grow and survive. And if something happened lower down, that would influence everything following that trophic level moving up. Or maybe your producers are really efficient one year and you can support larger populations and higher trophic levels. Which kind of brings me to what I've been talking about, right? Changes in energy availability really affect the entire ecosystem and all the energy flow in that ecosystem, right? When you have some sort of disruption to that energy, it's going to affect everything in it. Let's say you have a lot of sunlight available. Maybe that causes your producer level to go up. Things grow really well. Everything else flourishes too. Or maybe something happens where your plants aren't able to grow so well one year. And so everything in their higher trophic levels, you're going to see probably shrink because they are not supported by that producer level the same way they were. The point being, energy changes really affect population size throughout the whole ecosystem. One is not independent of another. They are interconnected, and they can really influence each other based on the outcomes that you might see as far as energy flow and population in that community. I hope this was helpful. I'll see you again soon.